Okay, so that's the end of Acts chapter 6, right? It's a little bit of a shorter chapter of Acts, so it's going to be a little brief today. But these chapters the next one's too long to kind of put in with this one, so this is a little bit shorter. So, a little recap before we go into chapter 6, right? And I'm doing this so it sinks into your brain. So by the time we're done with this, you'll be able to name the 12 disciples like we did, right? Or some of you were able to. And then you're going to know what happens in Acts because we're going to keep talking about it, right? So, Acts chapter 1 about being a witness, right? Just like being a witness on trial, you're witnessing what you've seen and what you've seen God do, and that's exactly what's happening in Acts. If you don't know, Acts is basically the beginning of the Christian church, right? This is the early church. This is before we had the New Testament. This is before we had Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? Those guys who wrote those books are in Acts, right? We don't really see Matthew. We see John Mark, who wrote Mark. We see Luke, who actually wrote Luke and wrote Acts. He's writing the book we're reading. And we see John with Peter, right? And we see Peter quite often here in Acts. And we're going to be introduced to somebody named Paul here later on. You all know Paul. He's very, very famous, right? And then we go into Acts chapter 2, and we have this thing called Pentecost. And who remembers what Pentecost is? Okay, so we get the speaking in tongues, right? But it's the day the Holy Spirit entered the disciples, right? Before Jesus ascended into heaven, he said, stay in Jerusalem until you receive the Holy Spirit. And it was on that day they received the Holy Spirit, and that's when they began speaking in tongues, right? And that was the signaling that Jesus was for everyone. It just wasn't for the Jews, right? And so then we have Acts chapter 3, and we have Peter and John performing miracles, right? Where you had these men who were they were fishermen, right? They weren't priests, they weren't holy men, and they went and they were disciples of Jesus for like 2 years, right? And they were kind of a little bit of misfits back then, and now they're doing the exact same kind of miracles that Jesus does. They're doing them in Jesus' name, though. They're giving no credit to themselves. They're giving all the credit to Jesus of Nazareth, right? And then we go into Acts chapter 4, and Peter talks about Jesus being the cornerstone that the builders rejected, right? So the cornerstone, we talk about that, is at the center of the building, and when you put that down into the ground, all your measurements are made off of that cornerstone. So if you don't get that right, the rest of the building's off, right? It's going to look like one of those really weird, crooked Dr. Seuss things, right? It's not going to be right. And Jesus was the cornerstone that the Jews had been waiting for. He was their Messiah, and they missed it, right? And then in chapter 5, right, we have Ananias and his wife, and they sold a piece of land. And because it seemed like everybody was doing this at the time, they were selling possessions off and giving it to the disciples to start the church. And he and his wife decided they were going to sell something off, and they were going to give the proceeds to the church. But they lied, and they said that we're giving everything from the sale to you, right? And they didn't. They held some back, and it was theirs to do with what they wanted. But they shouldn't lie, right? And they lied to God, and they lied to the Holy Spirit, and they lied to the disciples, and what happened? They dropped down dead, right? Dead as a doornail, right? Boom. And so we saw that, right? And so now we're in Acts chapter 6. And if you want to watch this video on your own, you can go to JesusFilm.org. It's the Jesus Film Project, right? And so we're just showing a little clip. And it's word for word from, I think, the NIV translation. So feel free to go ahead and do that on your own. Okay. So here we are. We're in Acts chapter 6, right? And so we're going to go a little bit into what's happening here. So we have the Hellenistic Jews, right? And we have the Hebraic Jews. So Hellenistic Jews, they're Jews that spoke Greek as their primary language, right? And they took on some of that like Greek culture, right? So they're not like the Hebraic Jews, right, who spoke Hebrew and Aramaic as their primary language. So these Jews are actually reading like the Jewish doctrine, what we call like the Old Testament, right? They're reading that having been translated to Greek, and they're not reading it in Hebrew, right? And so what happens? It said, so in those days the number of disciples was amassing, and the Hellenistic Jews among them complained against the Hebraic Jews because their widows were being overlooked in the daily distribution of food. All right. So if we go back to Jewish culture, widows weren't allowed to work, right? And if they lost their husband and they didn't have a son to help take care of them, they had to basically either do some other things. They had to do some gleaning, or they had to depend on the community, right? And so we have these Hellenistic Jews, the ones that spoke Greek, complaining about how they were treated by the Hebraic Jews, right? And the widows not getting enough food. So what they would do is the widows were allowed to do something called gleaning, right? And so farmers were commanded by God to leave the edges of their fields untouched, right? Or they would leave produce that had fallen to the ground, they would just leave it there. And then this was done so that the widows or foreigners or travelers could have something to eat, right? And so it's kind of like giving a portion of your crop to the needy, but you're kind of allowing them to come in and get it for themselves, right? It's not like you just have to like walk it to their doorstep. They do have to do something for themselves, so they're allowed to go and glean. And if you remember, we were reading back in John, some of the disciples were gleaning as they were traveling. I think they reached in and grabbed some wheat or something on a Sunday, and one of the Pharisees got upset with that because they were gleaning on the Sabbath, right? They were gleaning on the Sabbath, and it's like, well, you got to eat, right? You got to eat. Do you cook on the Sabbath, right? Right? Do you wake up and tie your shoes on the Sabbath, or tie your sandals, maybe? You know what I mean? So it's kind of like, what is considered work? And so this is what the widows did, and so they would often actually, as well, depend on the community, because if you're in Jerusalem, there's probably not a whole lot of fields, right? Because you're inside a big city. Not a whole lot of places to go glean unless you go outside the city. So there was this need, right? So the disciples, they saw this need, right? And so there was a need for somebody to help the widows, right, of this particular group, the Hellenistic Jews, but probably they were just going to make sure that everything was okay with all the widows, right? And so they decided, all right, we're going to pick 7 men full of spirit and wisdom to be chosen, right? Now, 7's an important number. We're not going to go into the number 7 right now, but just know number 7 is important, right? But full of spirit and wisdom, right? They didn't just pick anybody. They're making sure that they pick godly men, right? Not just godly men, but smart godly men, right? So they're filled with the Spirit, and they're either smart because of the Spirit or because they're just naturally smart, right? And then what we see is the disciples, they turn this responsibility over to the 7 so that they can do a few things. They want to be able to focus on prayer. I think that's extremely important, right? The disciples are deciding to turn this over to 7 different people so that they can focus on prayer, right? And I think that's something that we overlook because we see Jesus praying all the time, right? I mean, he was always praying, and the disciples were doing what? Falling asleep, that's right. Now, they also wanted to focus on ministry, right? Because this is the early church. What do they need to do? They need to spread the news of Jesus, right? And so what does this tell us about our ministry today? Well, to me, I see it that you don't need to do everything, right? If you look at Captain Harry, right? Is he doing everything in the church? No, right? He doesn't teach this class. Right? He's not doing Sunday school. He's not always cooking the food. He's not always teaching every single VBS class, right? He does partake in it, but he's not doing everything. And so what I think that says to us is that sometimes we need to step up and take on a ministry of our own, right? And what is our ministry going to be? And I saw my mom, she commented on a Facebook picture. I forget which one. It was something we were doing around here. It was either music camp or VBS or something. And she said, "I'm so glad you guys found an active church." Which is kind of weird because I didn't really grow up going to church. My mom didn't go to church. It was me saying we should go to church, right? You know what I mean? So it wasn't my mom making me go to church. But I found that comment very interesting because you don't always find an active church, right? And sometimes people think of church as like this building that you go to on Sunday, right? And that's not church. You're not just going to church. What you need to do is you need to be the church, right? Don't just go to an active church, be an active church. Does that make sense? Like, this isn't the church. We are the church, right? Church is not a place you go. Church is the people, right? Church is the news of Jesus. And so the other thing that we can do is what we see here is that we can see that your ministry can be focused, right? Stephen was given this specific ministry along with 6 others to focus on feeding the widows. But I think he actually takes it a step forward. Okay, so here we meet 7 people. We're meeting Stephen for the first time. I'm going to warn you, don't get too attached. And if you don't know what I mean, you can either wait till next week or read on to chapter 7. All right? And then we also see Philip. We're going to see Philip later. This is not Philip the disciple. This is Philip the evangelist, right? And so remember how we talked about the disciples and how some of them have the same name or some of them have 2 names or even 3 names, right? So we're trying to differentiate. This is Philip the evangelist, not Philip the disciple. And then we also meet Nicholas of Antioch. And when I was reading this, I was like, oh, that's really cool. He's a convert to Judaism, right? So, and if you don't know where Antioch is, it's just slightly, it's above Israel, right? So going up north before you kind of hook a left going into like Turkey, right? And so it's very interesting to me that he was a Gentile converted to Judaism and now he's a follower of Christ, right? Because most of the early Christians are Jews, right? That are converting to this new thing called Christianity, or the way, as we're going to see it called here coming up in Acts. And so we see this guy named Stephen, right? And it starts really focusing on Stephen, right? And like I said, don't get too attached to Stephen, all right? He starts performing wonders and signs, right? So we don't really see much of what that actually means to us, right? But what could wonders and signs be? Any ideas?
Able to do some type of miracle?
Yeah, so maybe he's doing some type of miracles, right? We don't know. It doesn't go into specifics, right? But we know Peter was walking around and people were just trying to get hit by his shadow so they could be healed, right? So we're thinking that Stephen is filled with the Holy Spirit and maybe he's doing some of these wonders and miracles as well. It says wonders and signs. So to me, it says that. We also see him talking, right? And he's talking with such great wisdom that these new Karens are coming into the mix, and they can't even argue with him because he's so full of wisdom of the Spirit, right? And we see that some of these people didn't like this, and so they started to lie about him, right? Which is kind of crazy because if you don't like somebody, and they're doing something wrong, why do you have to lie about it, right? Why would you have to lie about it if they're not doing anything wrong? It doesn't make any sense to me. And so they start doing false witnessing, which is kind of crazy because one of the 10 commandments is what? Do not lie, do not bear false witness, right? So same thing. All right, and so we see these people from other places, right? So let's just talk a little bit geographically where they're from and why they're in Jerusalem. So the first place we heard Cyrene. You guys remember Simon of Cyrene, right? Simon of Cyrene, the man who carried the cross with Jesus, right? because Jesus was too tired to carry it the rest of the way. Simon of Cyrene. So we have these Jews from Cyrene. So Cyrene is up here on the little tip of Africa, right, in modern day Libya. It's up here, right? And then we had these Jews from Alexandria being in Egypt, right? And then we also have, what was the last town? Cilicia, I think it was, which is kind of like over here in modern day Turkey, right? And then, of course, we know that everything is kind of taking place in this area, which is Jerusalem, right? So these Jews are coming in from these areas, and they're coming to Jerusalem because it's the Holy Land, right? These guys just aren't there just to be naysayers, right? This is the Holy Land, and that's why they're there. And so they secretly persuade some men to say that they've heard blasphemous words against Moses and against God, right? So they're just telling lies, right? Obviously, Stephen didn't do this. So they stirred up these people and they produced false witnesses. And then the worst part is they come back in here and they say, "For we have heard him say that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place and change the customs Moses handed down to us." Well, let me ask you something. Where's Jesus right now?
Hanging out with them.
Huh? No, I mean like right now in this story. What happened to Jesus? Is he dead or alive? He's in heaven, right? Because what happened? So at the end of all the Gospels, right? Jesus is on the cross. He's crucified. He dies. His body dies. They put him into a tomb, right? They seal the tomb with a giant rock. They seal it with a stamp, right? Like a wax seal, right? And they seal it up. And then what happens? 3 days away, the stone is rolled away. They go in. There's no body, and Jesus is walking around for 40 days, telling people about him and the way to God, right? There's only one way to God, and it's through Jesus, and that's what he says. Then he ascends into heaven. But where is Jesus now in Acts? He's gone, right? He's no longer around. So how on earth are they going to be upset if they say that Jesus of Nazareth will destroy this place? Is he around to destroy it? Right? Right? I mean, if I said, George Washington said he's going to come burn down this town, do you guys find that a threat? Is George Washington still around? No. And if they don't believe that Jesus is the Messiah, then why do they have anything to fear? I don't know, but for some reason they do. So they take Stephen before the Sanhedrin. And if you remember, what's the Sanhedrin? It's this group of the high priests and all of the Jewish elders from the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they sit around and they be Karens, right? And what do? They start telling these lies about him, and everyone looks at Stephen and they say his face is like the face of an angel, right? And I think, it's kind of funny because if you think about this, right, how do we generally view angels today, right? Little babies with wings, right, floating around, right? They're kind of like the whole like Italian architecture thing, they always have little baby angels, right? But no, angels are scary. They are big, scary creatures, right? Because every time you see an angel in the Bible, what happens? What do they say? Autumn, what do they say? They say, don't be afraid, right? Do not be afraid. So angels are probably terrifying, but I don't think at this point in time that they're describing Stephen as being terrifying, all right? No, I think they're trying to describe him as being something good. So in heaven, God is sinless and perfect, right? And how do you get to heaven? Through him, but can you go to heaven with sin? No. All right. So if you can't go to heaven with sin, you have to be sinless to be there, right? Who's hanging out with God in heaven? Angels, right? So are angels perfect, sinless creatures? They should be, right? So if they're perfect, sinless creatures, they're trying to say that Stephen looks like a perfect, sinless creature on his face, right? You're seeing those people and you just think, oh, wow, they just look like a great person, right? Or you ever been around those people and you're like, wow, they are a great person. You know what I mean? We had this pastor at our church in Pennsylvania, and he looked just like Santa Claus. And Candace is like, I want to go to Santa Claus's church. I want to go to Santa Claus's church. And I tell you, when you were around this guy, you could see the Holy Spirit like coming off of him, right? He just was filled with so much love, right? And you could see that on his face. Not just because he looked like Santa Claus, because that's what he was. He was filled with the Holy Spirit, right? And so they're trying to say that Stephen is a good guy filled with the Holy Spirit, and you can see it shining on his face, right? So it also might mean that he's pure of heart, right? That there's no wrongdoing in his nature, right? And you also see in the video, right? He's not eager to just like defend his actions. Like you all see like Judge Judy or Judge Joe Brown or those judge shows. If you don't know what I'm talking about, Candace watches them all the time, so she'll give you some good tips on them. But anyways, when people are being accused, what do? They interrupt constantly, right? And somebody will be telling their story like, I didn't do that. I didn't do that. And they'll be like, sit down, Mr. Mosteller, and you wait your turn, right? Now, sometimes the loudest person is heard the most, right? But sometimes not just jumping to defend yourself, right, is almost a better way to be. And this is what we're seeing from Stephen. And he's not just yelling and saying, no, that's not the way it is. He's just sitting there, so happy to be there, because he's going to talk about Jesus in a second. And he's excited to talk about Jesus. We also see him, he's just filled with peace, and we know that we've seen him and that he's filled with the Holy Spirit. And so that ends chapter 6 for us today. We end with Stephen before the Sanhedrin, and stay tuned for next week as we see Stephen talk before the Sanhedrin.